Okay, let's talk about a couple of other issues here. Let's start off, Eleanor, with the idea of Hong Kong continuing protests. China, how do you see that playing out in the coming weeks? I mean, it's a hard prediction to make, I know. But
Well, yeah, but the protesters have 4 or 5 months they've kept this up. And the Chinese government from mainland has done some terrible things, but has done not nearly what they could do.
Yes.
So they're tolerating the protesters. And I do think that they are going to work out a series of reforms that's going to continue this relationship between the mainland and Hong Kong, which gives Hong Kong a measure of freedom, but not full freedom. I think the protesters are going to end up being successful. I think they are successful.
Pat?
I'm not so sure. Xi Jinping did not do a Tiananmen Square 2, because he doesn't want a bloodbath there, because he's got long-term objectives. But I noticed that a lot of folks are leaving Hong Kong. Tourists are not going in. Businesses are relocating. You go to Shanghai, you go to Singapore. And I think the demonstrators, it's admirable. But I think one mistake they've made is the violence attendant to this, taking folks at the airports and interfering with planes, interfering with traffic, civil disobedience, attacking police. People all over the world that see these type of things, they say, I'm sort of with them for democracy, but I'm certainly not with them for these objectives. And so I don't know what the demonstrators do as the squeeze is constantly gets tighter and tighter, and more economic damage is suffered by Hong Kong. They are not going to let Hong Kong go, because this is about Taiwan. I mean, for the Chinese, and they're saying, if we let them go, you'll have the same problem inside China, and the Taiwanese will believe they can go.
It breaks the sanctity of the party. Yeah.
Right.
Clarence, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. It's a tough situation for both sides. The violence that we're seeing in the streets is the result of rage. They're just angry, and it's a heavily young crowd, and so they they want to show that they're not being patsies. At the same time, it is a time in which they're very disciplined about it. On both sides, their communications are excellent. You would think this was really more organized than it is, but they are able to communicate very well and respond quickly. So if the government will make some concessions and will seriously negotiate, I think you can see this all calm down, but that's still very tense. People are losing life and limb out there on the streets, and so it's a very tense situation.
Yeah, and I think sort of to cap off this issue, I do think the risk here is that Xi Jinping eventually decides, although, you know, and I was wrong about this, I thought it would have happened by now, that he has to move in with the military because it undercuts his narrative, which is, I am the new Mao, supreme leader, the party is supreme.
Why does he have to move now with the military when he's seems to be doing fine without having used the military, and he's held off doing it?
Because the issue is that it dilutes his brand as a leader, and it undercuts his credibility in dealing with people like President Trump, because it makes him prospectively look weak.
No, I don't think people are denouncing Xi Jinping for his handling of Hong Kong.
You don't think in the rumor mill and the standing committee and the Politburo?
No, I don't think so. I don't think they wanted Tiananmen too.
That's right. He could have, if he wanted to, he could have done a lot worse. I think he's getting some credit, if you will, for restraint, and I think the students are hanging in there. And usually, if you can wait out students, but these students are not going away. So I think there is a kind of a standoff now, but they've put a lid on it temporarily. And I do think, as Clarence says, that the Chinese government is going to make some concessions that buy time. And I think the protesters will, fade from the streets to some extent, having declared some victory. But the tension goes on because this is an awkward situation, and China's not going to let them go, but they don't want to kill the golden goose either. I mean, Hong Kong is a very rich industrial area.
The red line, I think, is no self-rule, no sovereignty, no independence. They're just China. I think if they attempted violently to break free, I think the Chinese would send in the military.
Well, I live in Washington, D.C., and initially we had home rule.
Right.
So I think you can give it some
There was
time,
no
some
home
kind of
rule
a
when-
better title.
Yeah.
But there was no home rule when I grew up in Washington, D.C., Ellen.
I know, but I think you probably took to the streets and got it, right?
One of the things that's interesting here, though, is the known or the unknown knowns, the known unknowns. Like what would happen if there was a major incident. We've seen some extreme violence from some of the protesters against Carrie Lam, the chief executive. Those unknown factors really could throw.
If the demonstrators, I think, go violent against the police, I think the proper thing, the Chinese would probably watch and let the world watch people attacking police and then say we're going to have to crack down because these people are risking lives, property, and everything else. We're not going to have insurrection and riots.
Well, they
And
don't
I
have,
think
they don't have weapons. I mean,
they're
this
not
is
doing it now, but
self-defense.
if they do it, Eleanor.
Well,
They do have these big slingshots that
Right,
that
okay.
operating in teams, and they
All
heave
right.
heavy objects toward the police, and that is.
But the question
has
is,
been remarkable.
they can lose the confidence of the silent majority. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm being facetious, but that's also
No,
some truth to that.
and
There is.
a case could be made, though, of course, that Eleanor says that it is self-defense against a tyrannical government. But let's go on to another issue. NATO continues to be in the news in the sense of defense spending in Europe and President Trump's position there. Pat, do you think we will see, well, what do you think will be the big developments with NATO in the coming year?
I think there's going to be a push among the neoconservatives and other hawks to try to bring Ukraine and Georgia in. I don't think it's going to happen. I think NATO nations in Europe would veto that as provocative. They don't want to fight there. I think that Putin is more small c conservative about what he's doing there than when people say he's going to rush through the Baltics or he's going into Ukraine and grab Luhansk and Donetsk. I don't think he's going to do it because the price is too high. They gave that up. What he wants is basically he would like to see the United States to get its troops and get NATO forces out of his border areas and basically be a great power again, which, like the United States, doesn't tolerate a lot of hostile regimes on its
Well,
borders.
if I have it correctly, the next G7 meeting, which is the NATO assemblage, will be at Camp David.
Right.
Will President Trump invite Putin?
Not at the Doral.
Yeah,
Not at the door.
yeah, right,
He wants to
exactly.
expand that to the G8 again.
Well, that's what I was just wondering. But it's not his decision alone, except maybe he figures if it's on his property, it's not really his property either, it's the taxpayers. But hey, what are all the leaders going to think when they're
I think
posted at Camp David? Maybe you've been to Camp David. It's a pretty
Right.
rustic place,
Yeah, it is.
unless he's painted everything in gold.
But
so-
you know, I think that some of the European nations might be receptive to the idea of talking to Putin. I think the Germans
Italy,
are. The
France,
Germans
yeah.
are. They're building that pipeline. I mean,
Yeah.
that pipeline across the Baltic Sea. The Italians, sure.
In French.
What's he going to do with Ukraine, though?
yeah, as long as he's
and,
in Ukraine, I
yeah.
think that's a
and
non-starter.
his involvement in Syria and the Middle East there is not a border area, I would say, but he certainly sees some strategic value in this.
I mean, they were in Syria when back in 1971. The Russians were. They had that naval base there. It's a little teeny base, but they had it there then.
I think it's a little larger now, I think.
It's larger. They got an air base in there now.
It is interesting, though, Eleanor, that it is not simply President Trump, right? The Italians, the French, the Germans do seem to be in favor, perhaps not as vociferously as the president in the way he says it, to have them back in the G8.
Oh no, they do business with
Right.
with Russia. Angela Merkel speaks Russia. She grew up under Russian domination in Eastern Germany. He's not a foreign presence to them, but they drew a line when he invaded a country, and that violated the world order, and so he's being punished. And I'm sure they all talk to him outside of NATO. It's not as though he's totally isolated at
But
all.
you know, in the Minsk agreement, Putin and Zelensky met in Paris,
Yeah.
and the sponsors, if you will,
With Merkel.
are Merkel and Macron. And so they are in, and this is not a bad thing to try to resolve this, and some way to get autonomy for Eastern Ukraine. At the same time, the Russians don't get out of there. and you get the end to the violence and the rest of it. As for Crimea, I'm afraid that's a done deal, Tom.
And you think President Zelensky seems to have accepted that? I mean,
Well, Zelensky clearly has. He has a problem in Kiev because a lot of the hawks in Kiev, they despise the Russians over a number of years, going back to the 30s and what happened with the Holodomor and all the rest of the collectivism and all the loss of life there in 1932-33. But I think Zelensky promised to try to bring peace into the eastern Ukraine. That's his campaign.
Yeah, and it should be the U.S. effort to bolster his hand and not bolster the Russians' hand in those negotiations.
You sort of wish that Obama had given him some lethal arms, huh?
We weren't at that stage then, and the Congress didn't go along with it. You're going to blame the president, this president, because Obama didn't give it, and so that gives this president a pass. That is such a
Trump for giving lethal aid, and Obama did a wonderful job. He gave him goggles.
It kept us out of war.
Actually, I know it's fashionable to make fun of that, but actually the Obama White House did a lot to professionalize the Ukrainian military. And if you really wanted to know about that, you could find out, but I'm sure you don't.
Well, they have
Clarence, what are your concluding thoughts?
They're fighting the war, even as we speak over there. Right. Are they going to give up the Russian sympathizing part of Ukraine? Do you think?
No, I think a federalist idea of the Russians should get out. These people should get a degree of autonomy. They should remain under basically Kiev. But at the same time, you got to get some degree of independence, like you're talking about Hong Kong.
Yeah. All right. Yep. That's about it.